She hadn't heard a human voice in 3 years. Not her own, certainly, for that had been buried along with the rest of her life under 10 winters of snow and silence. The avalanche had taken the cabin, the one nestled higher up the canyon, and with it, her husband, Jacob, and their 2 small girls, Ilara and Seren. It had been a Tuesday. She remembered that with a clarity that was both a razor and a balm. She had been down in the lower valley, checking the snares, a task she despised, but that Jacob insisted was necessary for their larder. The rumble had started not as a sound, but as a tremor in the soles of her boots, a deep, guttural groan from the mountain itself. By the time she looked up, the world was a cascade of white, a thundering, roaring beast of snow and ice devouring the sky, the pines, and the small wisp of smoke that had been rising from their chimney. She had dug. For 3 days and 3 nights, she had dug, her hands raw, her throat shredded from screams that no one but the stoic red rock walls could hear. She found nothing. Not a splinter of the life they had built. Not a scrap of the blue quilt Ilara had loved. Not a hint of the man who was her bedrock. The mountain had taken it all, and in return, it had given her a silence so profound, so absolute, that it became a new kind of sound, a constant hum beneath the skin of the world. So, Hanley Storr, the widow, had descended. She found the old line shack Jacob had used for his summer carving, a small, sturdy box of cedar and stone tucked into a fold of the canyon where the wind sang a gentler song. She moved in with what she carried on her back, a knife, a flint, a small pot, and the clothes she wore. She did not speak. The words had frozen in her throat that day, and she had no desire to thaw them. They belonged to a world that no longer existed. 10 winters passed. The sun bleached the memory of other faces from her mind, and the wind scoured the echoes of other voices from her ears. She became a creature of the canyon, her skin the color of the dusty earth, her hair a wild tangle of sun-streaked brown and gray, her eyes the clear, distant blue of the high desert sky. She learned the language of the rocks, the subtle shift of light that signaled the coming of a storm, the precise location of the sego lily bulbs after a rain, the secret paths of the mule deer. Her world was small, contained, and silent. It was a life whittled down to the barest essentials, survival, memory, and the vast, aching beauty of the land. She had her rituals. Mornings were for gathering, for checking the snares she now set with an impassive efficiency. Afternoons were for tending her small terraced garden of squash and beans, a practice learned from watching the ancient ones, the Anasazi, whose ghosts still whispered in the cliff dwellings that dotted the canyon walls. Evenings were for sitting on the flat rock that served as her porch, watching the sun bleed across the western mesas, painting the sky in hues of apricot and rose and violet. It was in these quiet hours that she allowed herself to remember, to let the faces of Jakob and the girls surface from the deep well of her grief. She did not weep. Tears, like words, felt like a betrayal of the silence, a concession to a pain she had chosen to carry as a stone in her heart rather than a river on her cheeks. Her husband, Jacob, had been a man of quiet contradictions. A geologist by training, he had been drawn to this land not for its mineral wealth, but for its stories, for the way the layers of rock told a tale 1 billion years old. He was a scientist with the soul of a poet, a man who could name every stratum of the Morrison Formation and then spend an afternoon carving the likeness of a raven into a piece of driftwood, claiming it had spoken to him. He had been her anchor, her compass, her quiet center. Without him, she was adrift in a sea of red dust and silence. The girls, Ilara and Seren, were echoes, bright, fleeting things. Ilara, with her father's serious eyes and a laugh that sounded like wind chimes. Seren, a whirlwind of dark curls and boundless energy, who collected shiny pebbles and believed they were fallen stars. Hanelli would sometimes trace their names in the dust with a stick, the only form of utterance she allowed herself. The wind would always come and wipe them away, and she would feel a strange sense of rightness in the act, a confirmation that they belonged to the earth now, not to her. This evening was like any other. The sun was a molten coin slipping behind the jagged silhouette of the opposite canyon rim. A lone hawk circled on a thermal, its cry a thin, sharp note in the vast symphony of the quiet. The air was cool and smelled of sage and dust, and the faint, sweet perfume of the cliff roses that grew in the shaded crevices. Hanley sat on her rock, her hands resting on her knees, her gaze fixed on the changing colors of the sky. The stone was still warm from the day's heat, a comforting presence against her worn trousers. And then it came. At first, she thought it was the wind, a trick of the air moving through the narrow-throated canyons, creating a phantom melody. But it was not the wind. This was a voice, a human voice. It was thin, reedy, and cracked with the uncertainty of youth, but it carried a melody that was as old as the stones around her. It was a song of rising and falling, of breath and release, a chant that seemed to pull the last light from the sky and weave it into sound. Hanley froze. The stone beneath her suddenly felt cold. Her heart, a slow, steady drum in the quiet of her chest, began to beat a frantic, panicked rhythm. A voice, here, in her canyon. It was an intrusion, a violation of the sacred pact of silence she had made with the land. Her first instinct was to flee, to retreat into the dark safety of her cabin and bar the door. But she couldn't move. The song held her captive. It was a sound so unexpected, so alien in her carefully constructed world, that it was like seeing a river flow uphill. The song grew stronger, closer. It was coming from the wash below, the dry riverbed that served as the main artery of the canyon. She could hear the scuff of small feet on the gravel, the soft, rhythmic intake of breath between the phrases of the song. It was a boy. She knew it with a certainty that defied logic. The voice had that unbroken, high, lonesome quality of a boy standing on the cusp of manhood. She rose slowly, every muscle tense, and moved to the edge of the rock, peering down into the deepening shadows of the wash. And there he was. A small figure, silhouetted against the last of the twilight. He was walking slowly, his head tilted back as if he were singing to the newly pricked stars. He was Navajo, she could tell by the cut of his worn jeans, the simple turquoise nugget tied with a leather thong around his neck, and the blanket draped over his shoulders. He couldn't have been more than 10 or 11 years old. What was a child doing out here, alone at dusk? The reservation was a good 2 days' walk to the east, across a stretch of hard, unforgiving country. There were no settlements nearby, no trading posts, nothing but miles and miles of rock and sky. He was lost. He must be. The boy stopped directly below her perch, though he gave no sign that he had seen her. He finished his song, the last note hanging in the air like a hummingbird, and then he stood in the silence, his head bowed. Hanley remained motionless, a statue carved from the same red rock as the cliffs. She watched him, her mind a whirlwind of questions and a deep primal fear. This was a disruption, a tear in the fabric of her world. The boy looked up then, not at her, but at her cabin. He seemed to study it for a long moment, his young face unreadable in the gloom. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he shrugged the blanket from his shoulders and spread it carefully on the ground. He sat down upon it, crossing his legs, and stared at her door as if waiting for an invitation. Hanley's breath caught in her throat. He wasn't lost. He had come here, to her. But why? No one knew she was here. She had been a ghost for a decade. She had seen prospectors and the occasional hiker from a distance, always hiding, always waiting for them to pass. But this was different. This boy had sought her out. He had sung at her door. The song. There was something about the song that tugged at the edges of her memory, a faint, familiar echo. It was a Navajo chant. She knew that much. Jacob had been fascinated by the Diné. their art, their cosmology, their deep connection to this land that they called Dineta. He had books, sketches, recordings. He would sometimes play the old scratchy tapes on a small battery-powered player, the ancient voices filling their small cabin with a power that was both beautiful and unsettling. But this song, it was different. It felt personal. Darkness fell completely, the sky a spill of diamond dust against black velvet. The boy did not move. He just sat there, a small, silent sentinel in the vastness of the canyon. Hanneli could feel the weight of his presence, a pressure against the carefully constructed walls of her solitude. She could ignore him, of course. She could go inside, bar the door, and wait for him to leave. By morning, he would be gone, and her world would return to its silent, predictable rhythm. But she couldn't. Curiosity, an emotion she thought had died in her long ago, was a small, insistent flame in her chest. And there was something else, too. A flicker of a feeling she couldn't name. It wasn't pity, and it wasn't fear. It was recognition. As if she had been waiting for him without knowing it. With a sigh that was more a release of breath than a sound, she turned and went back into her cabin. The single room was dark, the only light coming from the moon through the small square window. The air was cool and smelled of cedar and wood smoke and dried herbs. She moved with the sure-footed grace of someone who knew every inch of this space by heart. She lit the small kerosene lamp on the table, the flame casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. And then she saw them. The carvings. Jakob had carved them into the main support beam that ran the length of the ceiling. He had done it during the first summer they had spent in the line shack, while they were building their larger cabin up the canyon. He had called them his doodles, his mind wanderings. When she had asked him where the designs came from, he had just smiled and tapped his temple. "Some book, I suppose," he'd said vaguely. Or maybe they just flew in on the wind. They were strange, geometric symbols, unlike anything she had ever seen. They were not the familiar petroglyphs of the Anasazi, nor were they the flowing, organic patterns of the Navajo. They were something else entirely. Sharp angles, interlocking spirals, circles within squares, lines that seemed to map the constellations of an unknown sky. She had grown so used to them over the years that she barely noticed them anymore. They were just part of the texture of her home, like the grain of the wood or the cracks in the stone hearth. But tonight, in the flickering lamplight, with the presence of the boy outside, they seemed different. They seemed alive, charged with a meaning that had always been there, waiting for her to see it. She pulled the small, sturdy stool over to the wall and climbed up, holding the lamp aloft. Her fingers, calloused and rough from a decade of hard living, traced the deep grooves of the carvings. A spiral that seemed to turn in on itself, a series of chevrons that looked like birds in flight, a complex lattice of intersecting lines that made her head swim. They were beautiful, intricate, and utterly alien. A thought, sharp and sudden as a shard of glass, pierced the fog of her mind. The blanket, the boy's blanket. She scrambled down from the stool, her heart hammering against her ribs. She went to the door and opened it a crack, peering out into the moon-drenched night. The boy was still there, a small, still form in the silver light. The blanket was spread around him, and even from this distance she could see them, the symbols. They were woven into the fabric of the blanket, the same sharp angles, the same interlocking spirals, the same impossible geometry that was carved into the beam above her head. The world tilted on its axis. The silence of the canyon rushed in, no longer a comfort, but a roaring void. For 10 years, she had lived with these symbols, these doodles, from her husband's imagination. And now, a boy had appeared at her door, wrapped in the very same mystery, singing a song that felt like a key turning in a lock she hadn't known existed. Who was this boy, and what, in God's name, had Jakob known? She closed the door, her hand trembling. She leaned against the rough wood, the splinters pressing into her back. The cabin, her sanctuary, her fortress of solitude, suddenly felt like a cage. The silence was no longer her own. It was shared, and it was filled with questions that screamed louder than any voice she had ever heard. She spent the night awake, sitting at her small table, the lamp burning low. She did not look at the carvings again. She did not need to. They were seared into her mind's eye. She just sat and listened to the sounds of the night, the chirp of the crickets, the distant yip of a coyote, the soft sigh of the wind. And beneath it all, she could feel the steady, silent presence of the boy, a small, warm weight in the cold, empty landscape of her life. When the first hint of dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of pearl and gray, she made a decision. She would not run. She would not hide. She would face this, whatever it was. She opened the door and stepped out into the crisp morning air. The boy was still there, asleep, curled up on the blanket, his face peaceful and young. He looked so small, so vulnerable against the vastness of the canyon. A pang of something fierce and protective went through her, an emotion she hadn't felt since her own children were small. She went back inside and stoked the embers in the hearth, adding a few sticks of juniper. The wood caught quickly, filling the cabin with its clean, sharp scent. She put a pot of water on to boil and ground a handful of the roasted chicory root she used for a morning drink. The familiar ritual calmed her, the simple, repetitive motions a comfort in the face of the unknown. When the drink was ready, she poured it into 2 tin cups. She took a deep breath, picked up the cups, and walked outside. The boy was awake. He was sitting up, watching her with large, dark eyes that held no fear, only a quiet, unnerving intelligence. He looked from her face to the steaming cup in her hand, but he did not speak. She walked over to him and held out one of the cups. He hesitated for a moment, his gaze searching hers, and then he reached out and took it, his small brown fingers brushing against hers. The contact was like a spark, a jolt of warmth that traveled up her arm and settled in her chest. She sat down on the ground a few feet away from him, cradling her own cup in her hands. The sun was beginning to crest the canyon rim, spilling golden light onto the rocks, setting them ablaze. They sat in silence, sipping the hot, bitter drink. The silence was different now. It was not the empty, echoing silence of her solitude. It was a shared silence, a silence that was full of unspoken things. The boy finished his drink and set the cup down carefully on the blanket. He looked at her, and for the first time, a small smile touched the corners of his mouth. It was a shy, tentative smile, but it transformed his face, making him look even younger. He then turned his attention to the blanket, his small fingers tracing the woven patterns. He seemed to be showing them to her, pointing to a particular symbol, a complex knot of lines, and then looking at her expectantly. Hanley's gaze followed his finger. The symbol was one of the most intricate on the beam, a design that had always reminded her of a map of a city she could never find. She looked from the blanket to the boy's face, her own expression a mask of confusion. The boy seemed to understand. He pointed to the symbol again, and then he pointed to his own chest. Then he pointed up, towards her cabin. The meaning was clear. The symbol was him, and it was here. Hanley felt a wave of dizziness. She put her hand on the ground to steady herself. The world felt thin, transparent, as if she could see through the solid rock to something else, something other. The boy's eyes never left her face. He seemed to be waiting for something, a sign of understanding, of acceptance. He then did something that broke through the last of her resistance. He began to sing again. Not the loud, clear song of the previous evening, but a soft, low hum, a melody that was almost a whisper. It was the same song, but this time, it was not a summons. It was an offering. And as he sang, he began to fold the blanket. He folded it with a slow, ritualistic precision, each fold deliberate, each crease sharp. He was not just folding a blanket, he was performing a ceremony, and with each fold, the symbols seemed to change, to interact with each other, to tell a story. The spiral met the chevron, the square enclosed the circle. It was a language of geometry, a silent narrative of form and pattern. When he was finished, the blanket was a neat, compact square. He held it out to her, a gift. Haneli stared at the folded blanket, at the small brown hands that offered it. This was not just a blanket. It was a key, a map, an answer to a question she hadn't even known how to ask. She reached out and took it. The wool was rough and warm, smelling of sage and wood smoke and the boy himself. It felt impossibly heavy in her hands, weighted with the gravity of a story that was far older than she was. The boy smiled again, a full, genuine smile this time. He stood up, brushed the dust from his jeans, and gave her a small, formal nod. And then he turned and began to walk away, back down the wash, the way he had come. He did not look back. Haneli sat there, the folded blanket in her lap, and watched him go until he was just a small speck in the distance, swallowed by the vastness of the canyon. She was alone again. But the silence was different. It was no longer empty. It was full of the echo of a song, the weight of a blanket, and the memory of a boy who had remembered something she had long forgotten. She stood up and walked back to her cabin, the blanket clutched to her chest. She did not feel afraid. She did not feel confused. She felt awake, as if she had been sleeping for 10 years and had just been shaken gently from her slumber. She went inside and spread the blanket out on her table. The symbols seemed to pulse with a life of their own in the morning light. She looked up at the beam, at Jacob's carvings, and for the first time, she saw them not as random doodles, but as a message he had left for her, a message he had perhaps not even understood himself. "Some book," he had said. She went to the small, sturdy chest where she kept Jacob's things. She hadn't opened it in years. The dust was thick on the lid. She wiped it away with the sleeve of her shirt and lifted the heavy top. The smell of old paper and leather and her husband's faint, familiar scent of pipe tobacco rose to meet her. Inside were his journals, his geological maps, his books on botany and history, and at the very bottom, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth, was a book. It was not one of his scientific texts. It was old, the leather cover cracked and worn, the pages brittle and yellowed with age. There was no title on the spine, no author's name on the cover. It was completely anonymous. Her fingers trembled as she untied the oilcloth and opened the book. The pages were filled not with words, but with symbols, the same symbols that were carved into her ceiling and woven into the blanket on her table. Page after page of them, drawn with a meticulous scholarly hand. And next to each symbol, there were notes, written in a spidery, archaic script she couldn't decipher. It was not English, not German, not any language she knew, but she didn't need to read the words. The symbols were enough. They were a language in themselves, a language that spoke directly to a part of her she had thought was dead. She spent the rest of the day with the book and the blanket, comparing the symbols, tracing their lines, feeling their power. She felt a sense of connection, of continuity, that she had not felt since Jakob was alive. It was as if he were there in the room with her, guiding her hand, whispering in her ear. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the canyon floor, she knew what she had to do. She took the blanket and the book and walked outside to her sitting rock. She spread the blanket on the ground, just as the boy had done, and placed the open book upon it. She sat there for a long time, watching the sky change, feeling the cool evening air on her skin. She did not feel lonely. She did not feel sad. She felt a sense of purpose, a sense of belonging that went deeper than any human companionship. She looked at the symbols, at the ancient, silent language that connected her husband, a lost boy, and a forgotten history. And for the first time in 10 years, she felt a sound rise in her own throat. It was not a word. It was not a cry. It was a note. A single, clear note that was both a lament and a celebration, a sound of grief and of gratitude. She sang. She sang to the setting sun, to the rising moon, to the silent stones of the canyon. She sang the song the boy had taught her, the song that was woven into the blanket and carved into her home. She did not know the words, but she knew the melody. It was a melody that had been waiting in her heart for a decade, a song of loss and of finding, of silence and of sound. Her voice was rusty at first, a cracked and broken thing, but as she sang, it grew stronger, clearer, until it filled the canyon with a sound that was both her own and not her own. It was the voice of the widow, the voice of the mother, the voice of the woman who had been lost and was now, finally, found. She sang until the stars were a brilliant canopy above her, until the moon was high in the sky, until her throat was raw and her heart was full. And when she was finished, she sat in the silence, a new silence, a silence that was not empty, but was filled with the resonance of her own song. She did not know what the future held. She did not know if the boy would ever return. She did not know the meaning of all the symbols or the history of the ancient book. But she knew this. She was no longer alone. She was part of a story, a song, that was as old as the rocks and as vast as the sky. And that was enough. The cabin was no longer just a shelter. It was a sanctuary, a library of silent knowledge. The days that followed the boy's visit were different. The silence remained, but its quality had changed. It was no longer the flat, heavy silence of absence, but a resonant, listening silence. Hanley found herself moving through her days with a new awareness, a sense of being watched, not by a judging eye, but by a patient, ancient presence. The canyon itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting. She spent hours with the book and the blanket. The script in the book remained indecipherable, a tantalizing mystery. But the symbols began to speak to her. She learned to see them not as static images, but as dynamic forces, as diagrams of energy. The spiral was not just a spiral, it was the coiling of a seed, the unfurling of a fern, the great slow wheeling of the galaxy. The chevrons were not just angles, they were the beat of a wing, the striking of lightning, the path of water seeking the sea. She began to see them everywhere, in the crackle glaze patterns on a dried mudflat, in the branching of a juniper tree, in the way the light fractured through a piece of quartz she found in the wash. The world had become a text, and she was slowly, painstakingly learning to read it. She thought often of Jakob. She saw him now not as a man who had kept secrets, but as a man who had been a vessel for them. He had been a conduit, a channel, for something that had flowed through him and into the wood of their home. Some book, he'd said. Had he found this strange, leather-bound volume in some dusty university archive, a forgotten corner of a second-hand bookshop? Or had he, as he'd playfully suggested, simply plucked the symbols from the wind? She suspected the truth was somewhere in between, a place where scientific curiosity and mystical intuition met. He had been a man who walked in two worlds, and he had left her a bridge between them. One afternoon, while tending to her squash plants, her fingers tracing the spiraling tendrils of a vine, she felt a sudden, sharp memory. It was of Jakob sitting on the floor of the line shack, the beam resting on two sawhorses. He was carving, his brow furrowed in concentration, his tongue caught between his teeth. She had brought him a cup of water, and he had looked up at her, his eyes full of a strange light. "It's like music," he had said, his voice hushed with awe. "You don't carve the line, you just remove the wood that isn't the line. It's already there. You just have to listen for it." At the time, she had smiled, attributing it to his poetic nature. But now, she understood. He hadn't been inventing the symbols. He had been revealing them. He had been listening to the wood, to the stone, to the very bones of the canyon, and carving the song he heard. This realization sent a tremor through her. If the symbols were a song, then the song the boy had sung was not just a random melody. It was a translation. It was the audible expression of the silent, geometric language. She began to hum the tune as she worked, as she walked, as she sat in the evening stillness. The melody became a part of her, as natural as breathing. She found that the notes rose and fell in perfect correspondence with the patterns on the blanket. A rising scale for the chevron birds in flight, a long, low note for the square that represented the earth, a complex, trilling phrase for the intricate lattice of the star map. The song was the key. It was the Rosetta Stone that unlocked the meaning of the symbols. Her life, once a stark, minimalist existence, became rich and layered. The cabin was her loom, the symbols her thread, the song her shuttle. She was weaving a new reality for herself, a reality in which the past was not a closed door, but an open page, a reality in which the seen and the unseen were two sides of the same coin. One day, a new feeling began to stir in her. A restlessness, a desire. She wanted to respond, not just to sing the song she had been given, but to add her own verse. She found a piece of smooth, flat sandstone down by the wash. She brought it back to the cabin and, using the sharp point of her knife, she began to carve. She did not try to copy the symbols from the beam or the blanket. Instead, she closed her eyes and hummed the song, letting her hand move of its own accord. What emerged was a new symbol. It was a circle, but inside the circle were two smaller interlocking circles, like the cells of a dividing life. And from the top of the large circle, a single wavy line emerged, like a sprout reaching for the sun, or a wisp of smoke rising from a chimney. She stared at it, her heart pounding. It was a symbol of her own making, yet it felt as ancient and as true as all the others. It was a symbol of her family, of the life that had been buried, and of the new, solitary life that was now beginning to grow. It was a symbol of grief and of hope, of memory and of becoming. She placed the stone on the small shelf above her hearth, next to a feather from a bluebird and a piece of petrified wood Jakob had given her. It was an altar, her altar. The seasons turned, the heat of summer deepened, the canyon baking under the relentless sun. The rains came, brief, violent thunderstorms that sent flash floods roaring down the wash, rearranging the landscape, washing it clean. Autumn arrived, painting the cottonwoods along the creek bed in brilliant strokes of gold and yellow. The air grew crisp, and the nights grew long and cold. Haneli felt the approach of winter not with the dread of previous years, but with a sense of quiet anticipation. Winter was a time of turning inward, of stillness, of listening. It was the season of the deep hum. She had fallen into a rhythm that was both ancient and new. Her days were a braid of the practical and the sacred. She gathered wood, she preserved the last of her harvest, she patched the chinking in her cabin walls. And in between these tasks, she studied the book, she sang the song, she carved her own symbols onto small, smooth stones. Her collection grew, a silent testament to her journey. Each stone was a word, a sentence, a prayer, in a language only she and the canyon understood. One evening, as the first snowflakes of the season began to drift down from a leaden sky, she was sitting by her fire, the book open on her lap. She was looking at a symbol she hadn't paid much attention to before. It was a simple design, a long, vertical line with a shorter, horizontal line crossing it near the top. A cross. But not the Christian cross. This one was different. The horizontal line was not straight. It was slightly curved like a pair of gentle arms, and at the base of the vertical line, there were three small wavy lines, like roots or water. As she stared at it, a memory surfaced, unbidden and sharp. It was from their first winter in the big cabin. A blizzard had trapped them for a week. The snow was piled high against the windows, the world outside a swirling vortex of white. The girls were getting restless, and Jacob, to entertain them, had told them a story. It was a story he said his own grandmother, a woman from the old country, had told him. It was a story about a tree of life that stood at the center of the world. Its roots drank from the hidden rivers of the earth, and its branches held up the sky. The souls of the dead, he had said, climbed the trunk of this tree to become stars, and the souls of the yet-to-be-born slept like seeds in its branches, waiting for the wind to carry them down to earth. Ilara, ever the practical one, had asked him what the tree was called. Jacob had paused, a strange, distant look in his eyes. She never gave it a name, he had said softly. She just called it the axis, the place where heaven and earth embrace, the place where heaven and earth embrace. Hanley looked from the symbol in the book to the beam above her head, and there it was, the final symbol in the sequence Jacob had carved, the one right above the door, the curved cross, the axis. A wave of understanding washed over her, so powerful it left her breathless. This was not just a collection of symbols, it was a cosmology, a map of the universe. It told the story of creation, of life, of death, and of rebirth. It was a story of the great cyclical dance of existence, a story in which nothing was ever truly lost, only transformed. The avalanche, the snow, the mountain. It had not been an act of destruction. It had been an act of embrace, the earth taking back its own. Jacob and the girls, they had not been erased. They had climbed the axis. They were the stars she saw every night through her small window. They were the seeds waiting in the branches of the ancient pines. Tears, hot and sudden, streamed down her face. But they were not the tears of grief she had shed in that first terrible week. They were tears of release, of acceptance, of a profound and shattering beauty. The stone of grief in her heart did not disappear, but it was transformed. It became a geode, a rough, ordinary rock on the outside, but lined with 1,000 points of light within. She wept for a long time, the sound of her sobbing the only sound in the silent, snow-filled world. She wept for her husband, for her daughters, for the 10 years of silence, for the boy who had brought her the key, for the sheer, unbearable, glorious mystery of it all. When the storm of tears had passed, a deep peace settled over her. She felt whole. The broken pieces of her life had not been mended. They had been reassembled into a new and beautiful mosaic. She stood up and went to the door, opening it to the winter night. The snow was falling thick and fast, a soft, white curtain that muffled the world. The air was cold and clean, and tasted of ice and pine. She looked up into the swirling whiteness, and she smiled. She could not see the stars, but she knew they were there. She stayed there for a long time, letting the snowflakes melt on her face, feeling the cold seep into her bones. It was a good cold, a clean cold, the cold of a world being washed clean, being made new. She was about to go back inside when she saw it, a flicker of light far down the canyon, a small orange glow against the white of the snow, a fire. Her heart did not leap with fear this time. It settled into a slow, steady rhythm of knowing. He was back. She closed the door and added more wood to her fire until the cabin was filled with a bright, warm light. She put the pot of chicory on to boil. She took the blanket from her table and folded it neatly, just as he had shown her. She took the stone she had carved, the symbol of her own story, and held it in her hand. Then she sat by the fire and waited. An hour passed. 2. The snowstorm raged outside, a wild white dance, and then she heard it. A soft crunching sound in the snow outside her door. A gentle knock. She rose and opened the door. The boy stood there, covered in snow, his face red with cold. But his eyes were bright, and he was smiling. He was not alone. Behind him stood an old man, his face a beautiful, intricate map of wrinkles, his long gray hair tied back with a simple leather thong. He was wrapped in a blanket that was almost identical to the boy's, its symbols ancient and powerful in the firelight. The old man looked at her, his eyes as dark and deep as the night sky. He looked at the cabin, at the beam above the door, at the firelight that spilled out onto the snow. He did not seem surprised. He seemed satisfied, as if he were seeing the completion of a long-held prophecy. He said something to the boy in the flowing musical language of the Diné. The boy nodded and then looked at Hanley. He held out his hand. In his palm lay a small, smooth, dark stone. On it was carved a single symbol, a spiral, the beginning. Hanley looked at the stone in the boy's hand, and then she opened her own hand, revealing the stone she held, the one with her symbol, the circle with the two interlocking circles inside, and the single sprouting line, a new beginning. The old man's eyes widened slightly, and a slow smile spread across his face. He nodded, a gesture of profound respect and understanding. No words were spoken. None were needed. The language of the symbols, the language of the song, the language of the heart. It was enough. The boy stepped forward and placed his stone gently on the threshold of her cabin. Hanley, in turn, stepped forward and placed her stone next to his. The two stones, the beginning and the new beginning, lay side by side in the falling snow, a bridge between two worlds, two histories, two souls. The old man raised his hand, not in a wave, but in a blessing. He and the boy then turned and walked away, their dark forms soon swallowed by the white curtain of the storm. Hanley stood in the doorway, the snow swirling around her, the cold air on her face. She looked at the two stones on her threshold, at the warm light of her cabin, at the dark, swirling mystery of the world outside. She was a keeper of the symbols, a singer of the song, a guardian of a silent, sacred language. She had not spoken a word. She had not needed to. She had been heard. She closed the door, the soft click of the latch the only sound. She went to her fire and sat, the warmth seeping into her. The cabin was quiet, but it was not empty. It was filled with the presence of the ancestors, the whispers of the stars, the deep, resonant hum of the earth. And in the center of it all, in the quiet heart of the woman who had lived in silence for 10 winters, a new song was beginning. It was a song of harmony, wordless and whole. And it was enough. It was everything.